How many of you have heard of the dating app called Tinder? See some hands. I use that word dating app loosely. It's basically, from what I understand, I've not used it. I've just heard that you upload a picture of yourself. Maybe there's a little bit of a profile, and people who are on that app get to see your picture. And if they're interested in meeting you in person, they swipe your face to the right, your picture to the right. If for whatever reason they're not interested in meeting you or seeing you, they swipe you to the left. It kind of sounds like Jesus with the sheep and the goats, right? The sheep to the right and the goats to the left. Admittedly, I'm a novice with that app, but there's another app that's related to it that I have some experience with. And instead of Tinder, it's called Kinder. And Kinder is, it's not a dating app, nothing of that nature. It's an app that has to do with choosing babies' names. And the relationship, which at first doesn't seem like there is a relationship, is like this. Well, when you're on that app, when you're on that platform, it suggests your name. It gives a name to you. And if you think that that name is worthy or you're interested in it, like the sheep, swipe it to the right. If you look at that name, you see that name, and you think, I'm not interested in that as a baby name, you swipe it to the left. And what's cool about the app is if you're doing it with a partner or spouse, and they're on that platform as well, they get to see the names that you're interested in, the names that you're not interested in, and it gives you notifications if there's a match. Right? So you both have selected X amount of certain names, and they show up, and you're like, oh, we're both on the same page about said name. Jen and I used that when we were expecting Gracie. Even before we knew her gender, we were like, let's be prepared for boy or girl. We're going through all these names. And it just, thinking about it, brings me back to that season, that kind of long season of trying to come up with a name for a child. And I was surprised, I'd never really thought about it, like all that someone might put into selecting the name for a child. And I started asking myself questions I'd never asked before. For example, do we want it to be a family name? Do we want it to be a biblical name? Are we looking for something a little more classic, or is it something that's a little more modern? And then you get into more complex things like, well, we don't want unintended nicknames because of this name. Like you start thinking about your last name, I'm like, all right, what doesn't go with more, like what doesn't trend well with more? And then there are initials, right? We were good with Grace Elizabeth Moore because we think she's a gem. We're like, we're gonna be convinced she's our little gem. We're totally fine with it, but you don't want your kid to be MIA. Right? Like, I never thought about these things in my life. And then you start asking, well, does this lend itself to kind of integrity? Like, what do I want? Is this a powerful name? Is this a hopeful name? Is this an encouraging name? Is this a bright name? Is this a name that they're going to regret? Are we going to regret? Are people going to, you kind of go through that list. Well, long ago and far away in ancient times, and particularly in the biblical world, names had even, I dare say, even more significance when people were choosing names in the biblical names. Names often came with a certain meaning already, sort of imported in them. Sometimes the names were a reflection of the circumstances in which the child was born. For example, Isaac, it means he laughs. Jacob, he deceives. And if you know the biblical story, there's some significance there. And names would also represent kind of what people were hoping for their child. That their child might be courageous or something along those lines, and they'd give them a name that really captured that essence. And names back then were so powerful, so meaningful and significant that often names came to represent the person themselves, not their literal name, but just to talk about somebody's name, like, does that person have a good name or a bad name? Like this right here. And such that to say name itself was to be an equivalent for that person. To talk about that person's quote-unquote name was to talk about that person. I have a couple of examples. This one's from John 3. We're talking about Christ here. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not I'm wondering if I did pronounce something correctly, and it's like, okay, I'm just going to stand here. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. So we're talking about Christ here in such a way that that name was so significant, even to reference the person's quote unquote name could be to refer to the person themselves. Now a little bit further down the road in the book of Acts, similarly, we're talking about Christ. Salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. And here we're talking about salvation. Where do we find salvation? By putting our trust and our faith in the person of Jesus Christ. Well, long ago and far away, the idea of name was so significant that to talk about somebody's name was to talk about the person themselves. And here is an example, for there's no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. So to talk about Jesus is to talk about his name, and to talk about his name is to talk about the person of Christ. And I hope what I'm doing is painting a picture of the connection between the meaning and significance of somebody's name and tying it into the person themselves. And God was no different. To talk about God and his name was to talk about his character, even his essence. And there was significance there. Last week, we looked at the first two commandments. And part of that was to consider how God cares desperately about how he's represented in the world. We talk about, you shall have no other gods before me, and then you shall not make any idol or images that are to represent me. And that whole idea of idolatry, one of the many, many reasons why it's not acceptable in God's sight is how could something physically made with our hands or something drawn with our hands, how could it possibly capture the being of God? How could it actually represent the person of God? Because when you think about God, and you think about his perfection and his holiness and his wonder and his awesomeness, and there's dimensions of God that you and I we can't even fathom. And how do we take that and try and represent him with something that we make ourselves? God cares very much about how he's represented. Well, it turns out it's not just how he's represented in a physical sense by trying to create something, even in a verbal sense, even in the way that we talk about him or specifically talk about his name. This is the third commandment. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Third commandment. A very literal translation of this would sound like this. Thou shalt not lift up the name of the Lord your God for worthlessness. That's what we call a wooden translation. It's like looking at the Hebrew and saying, well, word for word, exactly what are they saying? Thou shalt not take up the name of the Lord your God for worthlessness or for a worthless purpose. Traditionally, in the King James, how does it go? This is how we memorize it as kids. Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain, which is actually pretty close to what the original Hebrew sounded like. Over time, spending time studying this text and the scripture, I've really grown to appreciate how the NIV renders it, and I think this really captures the commandment in its fullest sense. But the main idea is, thou shalt not take the Lord's name or use the Lord's name in a way that's worthless. That's what vain means, in an inappropriate or empty sense. Now, if we were to go back to some 3,000 years ago when they first saw this commandment, we'd ask, well, what were some of the immediate applications for them? How would this really apply in an immediate sense? And a couple suggestions stand out. One would be taking an oath. It wouldn't be uncommon for them to take an oath in such a way that they'd say, I promise to do this, and if I do not, God will strike me down. That's a way of trying to add some clout or credibility to an oath. The problem is, we don't have license to say that. God's not in the room. He's not signing the document. To take his name in such a way would be to misuse it, or to be a worthless way, because we don't have permission Matter of fact, it's disrespectful. Another way that it may have been interpreted or applied would have been in the use of magic in a world where magic was more commonplace than it is today. And people would have assigned a certain amount of power to a name and thought, well, if that name has power, then I'm going to use it. I'm going to try and employ it in this type of magic. And of course, magic would have been devious. And to use the Lord's name in that kind of setting, again, would be to misuse it, be inappropriate. One, it'd be false. Like we don't get to do that. To say in the name of God, I'm going to hocus pocus or whatever, and it's disrespectful. We don't have permission to do something like that. And then the sense is, with this commandment, that it's deliberately ambiguous. It doesn't give us a whole lot of detail right there, and specifically this is how you apply it. And it's believed that it's deliberately ambiguous, which helps us to apply it more broadly. So we don't have to think, well, am I trying to do magic here? Am I taking an oath? We can extend this a little bit. There's some more freedom, and let's get into that a little more. Now, if we were to fast forward to today, typically, when we think about this commandment and how do we apply it in the Christian world, and this is how I grew up. I grew up believing this exclusively with this commandment. Typically, we think, well, we don't use the Lord's name out loud disrespectfully, right? We hear it all the time in secular culture, sometimes even in the church, which grieves me when people say OMG, or sometimes people say JC, Jesus Christ, but they use it more like a profanity, casually, without any sense of respect for who they're talking about. And remember, names are serious. Names represent a person. Names represent the character, even the being of that person. And this verse certainly does apply that way, because that's misusing the name of the Lord in a worthless sense. Take it one step further, and this is where we go from the verbal to the nonverbal. The language, again, let's think of the traditional King James, to take the name's Lord. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. That language of taking the Lord or lifting up the name of the Lord also means to take it and to show ownership, to say that the Lord owns me. Some of you have worked for companies. I've seen you in this space where you work for a certain company and you put that shirt on, right? You put that hat on. If you've been in the military, you've got your fatigues. You are representing the military. You're representing Riverwoods. You're representing Alltown. You're representing Blockbuster, right? You're representing whatever that company is that you work for. You're saying, there's a certain ownership that they have over me in that sense. To take the name of the Lord is also a way of saying, I am His. Why does that matter? Because we live in a world, whether it's going to work or we just happen to have family and friends around and they know that you're a Christian, you're a follower of the Lord. To say that I'm a Christian is to take the Lord's name, to say, I am His. I am His. And then to take it in vain or to misuse it is to misrepresent. So now we go beyond simply just saying His name out loud. It's to take the name of the Lord and say He owns me, but to misrepresent. To actually misrepresent Him. To not give any sign of His integrity or His holiness or anything of that nature. And that's where this thing breaks wide open. And all of those other things, let's not take an oath in the name of the Lord. I think we've got that covered for the most part. Let's not appeal to magic. Let's not attempt to do any magic in the name of the Lord. I don't really stay up at night worrying about the flock, saying, oh, who's doing magic? Even using His name, I think we're pretty good as a Christian community in general to say, that's out of bounds. Let's not be disrespectful. But then here's the one that really breaks it wide open, is to say, to take the name of the Lord is to say, he's mine. And how do we represent him to the world around us? Right? And then you get to ask the question, well, how do we know that the Lord cares? How do we know that the Lord cares about this commandment itself? Just hypothetically. And the first thought that probably comes to mind, well, it made the top 10 list. Right? It's one of the 10 commandments, so we're thinking that alone, if this is God's summary of his law, if this is God's summary of his heart, and for it to make the top 10, that says something. But what if we complete the verse itself? For the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. That's the complete verse 11. It's kind of an open-ended way of saying there's consequence here. There are consequences to doing this. And I think what should stand out for us here is the way that God puts an accent on this particular commandment. He could have simply said, like others, he said, don't do this. Right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not murder. Don't steal. And those are just really abbreviated, staccato type commandments. Here he says, don't misuse my name. I will not hold them guiltless, the one who misuses my name. So it's a way of God really showing his heart here. In these first 3 commandments, we see God cares desperately about how he's represented in the world. That's kind of negative, right? There are consequences to this. How about the positive? Well, we can survey the Bible and come up with plenty of examples where it makes sense that God cares about his name. But how about when Jesus spent time with his disciples? And they asked him, they said, Lord, how do we pray? We want to hear from you. Rabbi, teacher, master, teach us how to pray. Imagine for yourself, you're literally asking God incarnate. You are looking into his eyes and saying, God, teach us how to pray. I want to hear it from you. I care about the rabbi teacher down the road. I think they're probably on track, but I want to hear it from you. And where does Jesus start? Our Father. He's in heaven. What's next?
Hallowed be thy name.
Hallowed be thy name. That word hallowed is kind of old churchy, isn't it? Hallowed has to do with holiness. What the prayer is asking is, Lord, that your name would be known as holy. Make your name holy in this world. And the ask is, this is God saying, this is how I want you to pray. Pray that my name would be known as holy in the world. That this world, that this creation would recognize my character. Let's appreciate the language that he uses. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name, because name is an equivalent for person, or in this case, God. There's an equivalence there. That's how tight this idea of name is. To lift up God is to lift up his name. To lift up God's name is to lift up the person of God. What does God want us to do with his name? He wants us to lift it up. What happens when we misuse the name of God? Do we lift it up? No.
Tear it down.
Tear it down. To misuse the name of God is to step on that which is meant to be lifted up. To misuse the name of God is to step on that which is meant and intended to be lifted up. The whole thesis statement for this series on God's law, specifically the 10 Commandments, is God's law reveals his heart, our need for a new one, and it helps to keep us from smelling like the world. That's my own language. God's law, including the Ten Commandments, reveals God's heart. What does God care about? Reveals our need for a new heart. There isn't a single one of them that we brush up against and say, I nailed it. When we truly understand his law, we realize, oh, make me new. It brings us to our knees. It reminds us of our need for Christ. We need God's forgiveness because we don't add up. And then it gives us structure, right? Always looking at the context. They just come out of one pagan nation. He's bringing them into another. They've just come out of Egypt when they first received the Ten Commandments. Now they're about to go into Canaan, a place where they worship fertility gods and any number of things that could lead the people of God astray. And God says, I am lovingly, not only am I going to share my heart with you, I'm lovingly going to give you some structure to keep you online, on track. It's not just glorifying to me, it's good for you. We need that. Like a good father who loves his sons and daughters, we need structure. And a commandment like this keeps us from smelling like the world, doesn't it? Not just the way that we use the name of the Lord out loud, but to think more broadly about how we represent him in the world. It matters. The Lord says, I care about it. Would you care about it too? It's funny the different ways that it can impact us. Not too long ago, I had some work done on my tractor up in the North Country. I brought my tractor into the local John Deere dealership and had it serviced. And it's a normal transaction. You have some work done on the tractor. They send you a bill in the mail. That's your prompt. Go online or mail them something or go online and pay it. It's a very simple model. I've been living by it for a while. So I go and I bring my tractor in. They do some work. Tractor goes home. I come back down here and I'm kind of patiently waiting for that bill to arrive in the mail. And it doesn't show, and it doesn't show, and it doesn't show. And then I get a phone call. And I get a voicemail from this guy that I know. I used to go to high school with his wife. And he said, hey Dave, it's Zach. It's not a big deal, but just got an outstanding bill. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind paying that bill, whatever. He's fine about it. But I'm thinking to myself, my answer, if you've ever called my cell phone and got my answering, my answers, hi, this is Pastor Dave. I'm not here right now. So just right up front, God has claimed me. I am his. People know that we're walking with the Lord. There's a certain responsibility that comes with it. And I remember thinking to myself, I called him right back. I said, Zach, I'm so sorry you had to call me. I've just been waiting for the bill and then, basic transaction, whatever. He was fine with it. But I remember thinking, that's so unfortunate that he had to do that. And then I pay the bill and it dawns on me, well, I've just moved from Exeter to Stratham. And if you've ever moved from one location to another, you know that one of the tedious parts of moving is all these companies and people who have your name and address on file, you need to update them. And if you don't, they're probably going to send your mail to your former address. And it's either going to get tossed in the recycling bin or bounce back to them, and that's what happened. But in that moment where he's calling, and I thought, I hope to talk to him at some point, just be like, this is what happened, Because you realize it's not just your reputation that's on the line. It's not just your sense of integrity. Yeah, we represent the Lord. We represent the Lord in this world. And that's just a benign, it's an everyday kind of thing, but just to show you, when I take the Lord's name, I want to take the Lord's name seriously and with integrity. And even in an interaction like that, I want the optics to be good. I don't want them to be bad. Because it's not just me. Right? It's the Lord. It's the Lord. And sometimes it's more devious, and that's when it's more grievous. A good friend of mine worked at CBD, which is Christian Book Distributor down in Massachusetts. It's kind of the Amazon of Christian books sellers, and he worked in their call center. This is when we were in seminary years ago. And it turned out that when he worked in the call center, he actually worked with a lot of non-believers, people who didn't know the Lord. Right? And these are the people who receive the phone calls every single day of people who are kind of looking for their stuff, that not just ordering, but they're calling with complaints. demanding certain things. And he always felt bad because here he is working for this Christian company. You've got these non-believers who are there, and what's the witness? And a lot of the people calling in were very demanding and impolite. And this is the hard part for me. And he said, you know who the worst offenders are?
Christians.
Typically it's the pastors. He says typically it's the pastors who are the worst, who are calling into this place. He's looking around, he's trying to develop a rapport, a relationship with these folks. He's trying to show them the love of Christ. He wants to represent God well. And you've got these, just the fact that it's Christians calling in, but then you've got those who are really claiming this sort of other calling. And it's not just that they look bad, it's a bad look for the Lord. They're taking the Lord's name in vain. They're misusing the name of the Lord, whether they're saying it out loud or not, because they're claiming his name and his ownership, and they're misrepresenting, and it crushed me to hear that story, because when we misuse the name of the Lord, we're stepping on that which is meant to be lifted high.